Hi everyone, I'm Yao Hui, the Assistant Secretary of the Economic Society of Singapore. A very warm welcome to our Society's panel discussion forum on Post-Singapore Budget 2021. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the chairperson of today's event, Mr. Manu Baskaran, Director and Chief Executive Officer of Centennial Asia Advisors, and Vice President of the Singapore Economic Society of Singapore. Manu, please.
Thank you, Yao Hui, and a very good welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon. Thank you for taking time to attend this webinar. The Singapore Budget 2021 that was announced yesterday was planned at a very difficult time for Singapore. We have overcome the worst of the COVID pandemic, but we are in a very difficult time. A period of great turbulence, not just because of the COVID pandemic, where hopefully there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a very interesting time for all of us. We have geopolitical issues, the US-China tussle, which spills over into world trade, which of course is our lifeblood. We have a whole series of dislocations that are being caused by new technologies that are maturing and reaching a takeoff stage. We've got more inward-looking policies in many countries that's affecting the quality of the globalization that Singapore is really such a huge winner of. So Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat really had an onerous task to try and make some very important decisions in the context of such extreme uncertainties. So it is not an easy budget to announce, but he has introduced a very interesting budget with some fairly innovative ideas. For instance, the resort to bond financing, which we have not seen for many decades. And of course, other new things like the commitment to sustainable economics and so on. But that's not up to me to say. We have assembled today a diverse panel of speakers from different backgrounds so that you, the audience, can get a rich and diverse perspective on this very, very important budget. So the format for today is quite straightforward. Each of the speakers has about 10 minutes according to the format, but honestly, if speakers, you need a few minutes more, please take it, because the important thing is to have interesting ideas rather than be limited in a very rigid manner. But we do want to leave enough time for our participants to ask questions and give their comments. So after the speakers have had their say, we will open up, and I hope that there will be lots of interesting comments and questions so that we can have a very enlightening discussion. We have 4 speakers, as I said. We start first with Professor David Lee from the Singapore University of Social Sciences, and he's also Vice President of the Economic Society. Thank you very much for joining. He comes with rich experience in diverse areas in academia as well as in business and in technology. Second, we have Ms. Lina Ling, who is Chief Economist at OCBC Bank and has been watching the Singapore economy again from different perspectives, from government as well as from the banking sector, for a very long period of time. Third, we have Dr. Stephen Cochrane, who's Chief Economist for APAC from Moody's, and he will be able to look at the issue from a very international perspective and give us a contrast and comparison how Singapore is doing in fiscal policy relative to others. Finally, we are very fortunate to have Associate Professor Bao Te from the Nanyang Technological University. He's published extensively on a series of topics, and he is also conversant in the areas of technology. So we have a very good panel, and it is now my pleasure to invite Professor David Lee to kick off the proceedings. David, thank you.
Thank you very much, Manu. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about Singapore budget, and it's certainly a pleasure to be sharing the webinar with some esteemed speakers here today. I don't have much to say today, but I see a lot of opportunities from the budget itself. And I think you can more or less guess, because the first slides that I have, you could see that is fairly green there. So that is where today's theme will be. I can summarize the budget as very comprehensive. Whether it's for individuals or corporates, we see that there is households support package, GST, hawker and local shops, HDB heartland, education, and even the drivers. So in terms of every sector and every individual, I think it covers quite a wide range. And for the corporates, it's a spillover from last year, which we have a huge budget deficit. And we still see the job support scheme, wage support, job and skill package, which is 5.4 billion carryover. There's another 3 billion that's carryover from last year to maintain the 200,000 jobs and 35 traineeships opportunities that we see. And then this year, I think we saw a few new tech that came along. One is Affinity, which has to do with identity under the Temasek investment. And we also saw a few trace tech for the COVID. So I call that COVID tech, which is very interesting that we are focusing on. And then we are moving into corporate VC, which usually drives the innovation space quite a fair bit. I do have some questions towards the end. And then, of course, we have the Open Innovation Platform, Global Innovation Alliance, to ensure that the startups and the businesses are able to reach out locally as well in other countries. Then there's Enterprise Fellowship Program, co-funding adoption of tech. And there are two things which are very interesting. The first one is a pledge 24 billion for innovation and transformation over 3 years by DPM. I think that is very exciting to me. And there's also a very interesting 1 billion, which I'm still trying to find out. I'm sure there'll be more information coming out, especially the term CTO as a service. So there's something that is very new to me that I'm just looking into it and trying to find out more. And of course, there's a digital leadership program, which I think quite a few people are familiar with. So all in all, it's 107 billion budget. And last year, we drew 42.7 billion, lower than expected. And this year, we are talking about 11 billion. And it just happened that 11 billion is a COVID-19 resilient package with all the vaccines and so on. So it matches quite nicely. And then in terms of revenue, we see 76.6 billion and 19.6 million from the investment returns that we have. And that again nicely matched the 19 billion in the public sector green projects, which I sort of thought I'm sure they're not matching, but the thing that it just caught my eyes that these two are big numbers. So the 24 billion and the 19 billion are absolutely interesting as far as innovation is concerned. And also there's another big number, which is up to 90 billion for infrastructure, MRT and all the walls for the, the sea and flooding and so on, which I think there will be a lot more new technology that we will probably be looking at. And these are the bonds that maximum amount of bonds that can issue under the Significant Infrastructure Government Loan Act. So that caught my attention too, which I thought is very interesting. So in short term is transitional. As Manu was saying, we're still going through a difficult patch, but I need to congratulate Singapore. I think we have done quite well. And I think looking at the unemployment numbers, a lot of us expected it to be a lot worse than what we are seeing today. And long term, I think hidden in all the information that we have is actually transformative and is very transformative as far as I'm concerned. And today my focus is on green and sustainable development. I think Dr. Baute is going to talk more about EV, so I'm not going to talk about that. But you can see that a lot of policies gearing towards any energy efficient vehicles. And then the agri-food cluster is for food security and resilience. Then we have the green plan, called the Green Plan, which released on February the 10th for up to 2030, which I think is a focus that I want to talk about today. And that is to tie in with the UN Social Development Goal of 2030. And that I think is absolutely inspiring because it's talking about green, low carbon, high quality development. And it spans across all sectors: construction, finance, logistics, mobility, housing. So it's a very, very good plan as far as I can see, because it is just not one of those plans that only a segment of the population will benefit, but this will probably be the start of a very interesting strategy that we have. So that's domestic unity and international integration, because of green finance, and also BRI, which I'll talk about 2.0. It's about responsible country responding to a climate change, and also promoting building of a community and a shared future for mankind. And it's absolutely interesting for education institutions like ourselves, which I have not heard anything so far. I'm sure there is from the university perspective. And we are, in some way, really got much smarter, because it's from smart nation to a global city of sustainability. And I think that switch is very, very significant as far as the national strategy is concerned. And it's about city in nature, sustainable lifestyle, green energy, green economy, resiliency. We talk about zero waste, and you can see a lot of business opportunities there: recycling capability, construction materials, reducing contamination, and then we talk about car-free MRT, lots of business there, underground road, walking and cycling 3 times more, public transport, schools, and then we have the energy reset from natural gas to solar energy 5 times. I think that is very, very significant, because I see on board a company that does solar energy for Vietnam as well as Indonesia and Bangladesh. I can understand where the opportunities are. And there's also that a lot of other imports that we can look at even for energy consumption to reduce, for water recycling. And then there's sustainable transport, as well as the entire green economy that will create new jobs, new investment, greenhouse emission. That ties in with the new Temasek CEO that in his interview talking about sustainability and also green finance. So we can see that we have the plan to become the leading carbon and servicing hub, leading green finance center. And then we also have decarbonization technology and making Jurong Island as a showpiece to the rest of the world. And of course, we worry about sea level and so on. I think, and also food supply, these are all very major initiatives that will span the whole space of the entire old economy to equip with the kind of technology that they want. And it's a lot more easier to understand than blockchain or AI or other technology that we have been talking about. Of course, those are important, but I'll raise some issues later. Then there's a BRI 2.0, and you will see this. This is very much the same type of strategy that China is adopting. So China is adopting very similar strategy, but they are ahead of the curve. And Zhejiang has got a great transformation in Wuzhou, and you can see all the technology empowerment that they have in the government policy, and they are taking the world leadership in terms of setting the standards, the technology specification, and they're looking at the expansion into BRI, because for BRI, really, you can't be destroying the environment when you want to do a lot of construction. So I think it's a very good plan and tie in a lot with what Singapore is doing in terms of our digital infrastructure, for digital currency, for fundraising platform through the SGX, our project Ubin, and also all the GATS that we have, which is for trade and so on. So we can see that there are a lot of positive things happening in China, which I think we can borrow that to learn from them about how they have done in terms of how they have proceeded, because they are ahead of us. And of course, there's great opportunities for fintech and digital technology because it's all about pollution control, energy conservation and emission reduction, and there are plenty of financial products like green loans, green bonds, green insurance, and carbon futures and other derivatives that you can see that China is developing, and financial innovation, technology, standard for hard and soft infrastructure, financial performance evaluation standards, asset allocation, environmental risk management, as well as regional digital infrastructure. And China has got quite a lot of interesting thing in the sense that those green bonds can be treated as reserve in the central bank. And if we can do that globally, all the sovereign wealth fund and so on will start loading up on the green bonds with sustainability, and that present a great opportunity for Singapore financial sector. And there's also a cost of doing, I think this is where I'll stop because I only have 10 minutes, so I'm not run past my time. I do have some questions because I don't have answer to all this, and I want to pose to the rest of the panel members and whoever have answers to this, and that I think we still have not addressed the issue of the cost of doing business. Whether this is a perception or this is real, I think it's important to address the cost of doing business, renter and so on. And I hope it's not a mindset switch from trying to impose import taxes to sort of shield that issue of high cost of doing business. We still need to look into that in some ways to address that. Of course, there are a lot of packages to alleviate the kind of pain that the businesses are looking at. But in the longer term, I think this is strategically very important to look at how do we reduce the cost of doing business. I think it's important. Otherwise, if that's not one of the important criteria of pulling up the country, having more new technology, attracting more wealth management and attracting more migrants, we do need to worry about the cost of doing business, especially through rental and property prices. And that's the sustainability of the old economy business post-COVID versus the resilience. Whether the business themselves actually have pulled up enough to be resilient when post-COVID, especially if the cost of doing business is high. And then there's the employment situation, which is very good now, 4% unemployment, much lower than all of us expected. And I think it's an amazing job that the government has done. And also for skills upgrade, how fast are we doing that? Are we seeing that coming through? Especially those between 40 to 60s, are they really pulling up in the skill updates? I think, and also the market structure. Are we going to have a more inclusive market structure, or we still have a very skewed market structure where it's dominated by large corporate, and then knowing that the SMEs create a lot of jobs as well. So we need to look at how to have a more inclusive market structure, especially we are talking about corporate VC now versus the startups. So an inclusive culture for business is very important, and that and also the structural issues that we still have not addressed, quite a few of them, versus the short-term profits issue. Do we need big businesses to have a certain amount to spend on research and development, like Huawei, and Alibaba, and you look at all the Chinese companies and American tech companies, they put aside a huge amount to build out the IP and the patents and the open source and so on. Are we spending enough in those for big corporates that we are seeing? Right, then the budget, some people that I talk to, especially in the tech sector, they say something is missing. I think there's more to come, because I think there are a lot of things that we have done last year which are not being emphasized in this budget, because, perhaps because of time constraint. I suppose the next few days we'll probably hear more about that. As far as green tech is concerned, again, do we have enough talents? Are we going to go through another new training programs that we have? Or are we going to import more talents? I think those are the issues. I don't have the answer to that. In terms of inclusive and sustainable tech, is it solely green, or are there more sustainable tech that we're talking about? And the main thing that I'm concerned about in the business ecosystem, which I find that is very lacking in Singapore, is collaboration efficiency between large corporations and SMEs. And I'm not too sure how the corporate VC can resolve this collaboration efficiency on an equal footing. Right? So that is something that I'm very concerned about. And then there's a convergence of technology. We hear a lot about AI, cybersecurity, and health. Should we also re-emphasize those things that we have in our plans? Otherwise, we will think a lot of people who told me that they feel that something is missing is that they're asking me, have we changed our priorities? Have we switched the direction for our tech development? My own view is that we have not. I think that needs to be a bit more emphasized. And also that we are moving from digital economy to a decentralized digital economy, which is token economy, which MAS has been working on, inclusive fintech, token economy, and that I think will still be a very major part of our national strategy. So thank you very much. That's all I have to share today. I'll pass it back to Manu.
David, thank you very much for sketching out so many very interesting ideas, and especially for posing those key questions at the end, some of which have already elicited one question from our audience. So thank you for that. Let me now move on to Selena and invite Selena to give a presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. I don't have any slides to share, but I'll focus my discussion on around two topics. One is really taking stock of what is Singapore's fiscal health at this juncture. And secondly, how are we going to pay for all these things that we're spending on? And in particular, I would like to zoom in on the Singapore bonds. So I think the first question we really want to answer is Singapore's fiscal position actually stretched such that we've had to tap 53 billion of our past reserves and to run a second year of deficit? And more importantly, is the first deficit for the first year of a new term of government, which is highly unusual. I think the short answer to that really is that actually our government's balance sheet still remains fairly strong. It's quite a testament to our fiscal prudence over the many decades that we can afford to spend, nearly 100 billion last year and more again this year, and have a significant tap of our past reserves and still be able to talk about very large scale infrastructure projects, investments. Okay, so to a certain extent, if you want to put it in a sports analogy, we're down but not out. Okay, so I think going ahead, if you want to look at the 2021 budget, obviously it's still expansionary. I think we all know the headline numbers. We're running a deficit of 2.2% of GDP. This is down from 13.9% last year. Last year really was a year of records. I mean, we had more than 4 budgets. Like the TPM and Finance Minister Hayes said, hopefully we don't have more than one. Because if we do, it does suggest that actually the economic situation is worse than the recovery story that most of us have priced in for the rest of this year because of vaccination. So one way to look at the 11 billion draw that we are having on the past reserves this year, it really is like what David pointed out. You are spending it on the 11 billion that will go to the COVID-19 resilience package. So if you strip those two items out, which is very much COVID related, actually we are back to a fairly neutral fiscal position, right? And then the caveat, of course, is we don't know what's going to happen down the road. So if need be, they may need to spend more again if the economic circumstances turn south again. So this seems to be the general mantra for policymakers around the world, not just Singapore itself. So that brings me to my second discussion point, which is how are we going to pay for all this spending? So we all know that the 2% GST hike won't happen this year. It's still on the horizon out to 2025. You can debate whether it's going to be 2022, 23, 24, or 25. My guess really is that we need at least 12 months to kind of get approval print to say, yes, we're finding out this crisis. So it's probably not going to be in 2022. And I think it's also not going to be in 2025 because no prudent policymaker wants to leave it to the last minute and squeeze in an 11th hour hike. So my baseline scenario is if things are on a much stable footing 12 months from now, then they may pre-announce for the hike, whether it's in 1 step or 2 step, but the likely time frame we're looking at is possibly 2023, 2024, okay? So in the interim, besides the draw on the past reserves, what else are they doing to raise revenue? You have petrol duties being hiked, you have ERP charges going back up, although that was not part of the budget. You also have GST being levied on, purchases of low-value items from overseas. Previously, we used to shop happily below $400. We don't pay the GST. From 2023 onwards, we're going to have to. Okay? But I think what's quite interesting is this reintroduction of the Singapore bonds, and the Singapore bonds standing for the significant infrastructure, bonds that they're going to issue. As Manu alluded to, they have 90 billion cap, and they haven't done this for a long time. Back in the 1970s, 80s. They did use to issue bonds to finance infrastructure. So the first MRT lines, Changi Airport, T1 and T2, But in the 1990s, even we didn't need the money, so they didn't have to do that. So now in 2020, 2021, we're kind of back to that story. We actually need to finance some of the large upsum costs for certain projects. So some of the new railway lines that they're looking at, Cross Island Line, the Jurong Rail Line, etc. Okay, and of course, building the seawalls to combat climate change and rising sea levels. So what's quite clear is that there are some safeguards and some principles that will still be adhered to even with the issuance of the Singapore bonds. So they said that the debt securities are being issued is not for spending purposes, not for recurrent development. It's clearly only for critical projects on the development expenditure side. The cap of 90 billion over 15 years, if you just do a straight line amortization, you're looking roughly at about 6 billion a year. Okay. In terms of size, it's actually quite sizable. It's actually 2/3 of the outstanding SGS bonds in the market. Okay. So of course, if you look at it from a market practitioner point of view, you will have concerns about supply issues. Are we going to get oversupply of longer dated type of bonds? Will they be competing with the buyers for long dated SGS bonds, the Singapore government bonds, which are really your insurance and your pension houses, right? Because they need to do asset liability matching. So the reassurance I think MES is probably going to do is to manage the supply of what they call the SGS bonds and also the new Singapore bonds on a very holistic manner, meaning that they're not going to cannibalize each other, right? So the earliest time frame we're probably looking at for the first issue of the Singapore bonds probably is the end of this year. And then from next year onwards, if they have a calendar, an issuance calendar similar to what we see for the Singapore government bonds, maybe that will give a lot more clarity and reassurance to the investor base and the trading community that is going to be managed very, in a very holistic and synergistic manner. Okay. And then the other reason why they say we need to do these Singapore bonds really is that it's for equitable and efficiency angles. So my comment here really is that it's nice to talk about intergenerational equity, but as all of us economists know, it's very hard to quantify how much each generation should pay for the different projects that span a long period of time. So I think the key question will really come down to safeguards again. Okay. So I think some of the potential safeguards, apart from the absolute cap of 90 billion and the limitation to just non-recurrent development, I thought what was quite interesting to consider could be certain areas, for instance, like, do we want to implement other fiscal rules? There are golden rules of debt stock not exceeding certain percentage of GDP elsewhere in the world. Do we want to have a similar fiscal rule for the Singapore bonds over time? How do we track the outcomes? Do we want to have independent audit boards, for instance? So some of these issues, I think it may be good to have a little bit more consultation and a little bit more discussion about how to run this in a fairly transparent manner. Okay. And then I also have a few unanswered questions even after yesterday's budget. I think the key question we all have is we don't know exactly when GST is coming. I think probably only the finance minister knows. But I think if you go by the earlier estimates that the 2 percentage point hike will add about 0.7% of GDP per annum, that obviously is not going to cover the 52 billion or 53 billion hole that we have made in our past reserves. So are there actually any intentions on the longer time frame to make good on the drawdown of reserves? I think that was one question that was not answered. And then let's get into the whole nitty-gritty of this GST on goods valued less at $400, right? So I think in the short term, initial teething period, you should expect that, logistics firms may feel a bit of the hit because people, the small players out there in the world don't know whether they should register, how to register, etc. Right? But as we have seen in the past experience, like the tax on services, like Netflix, for instance, after a while we all adjust. We just take the extra payment into our pricing formula, right? But I think it's going to be a little bit tricky because if you have lots and lots of small players out there, your Taobao type of world, how are you going to encourage them to register. They may just decide that it's not worth their trouble, right? Because Singapore is a small market, right? So maybe consumers here will lose out a little bit. And then if they don't register, how are you going to penalize them? How do you go after these guys? From a regulatory point of view, also it could be quite challenging, right? So maybe you only go after a specific few big guys. And then the question is 7% or 9% GST going to make the difference to the local retail scene? I'm not sure it's going to be that much of a deal breaker, if you ask me, because when you buy things from overseas, the overseas shipping costs also could be easily a few percentage points, right? So I think the question at the end of the day, or the crux of the matter, really is the fact that you need to have that variety, that customization, the huge array of the products and services that the world out there is offering. And maybe that's where the local retailers are finding hard to compete with overseas retailers. So if local retailers can actually up their game, they can offer like for like at competitive prices, then I think this levying of the GST on the small goods and services is going to make a difference. So my 10 minutes is up. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selina. And again, thank you for raising some very interesting points, particularly the questions like, should we have a golden rule for the fiscal like other countries have, and also the independent audit of outcomes. And clearly, I think that's a very important issue that we probably will hear more of in coming months and years. So thank you, Selina. And let me now turn the floor to Stephen Cochrane, and I look forward to your comments, Stephen.
Thank you, Manu. So I also don't have a presentation, but I would just like to make a few points with a focus on comparing the budget proposal to what I'm seeing elsewhere in the world in terms of how fiscal policymakers are approaching this year versus last year, and trying to reconcile the needs of continued stimulus with often very difficult budget situations. So I want to divide my points into two different types. One is simply just looking at the fundamental assumptions that the policymakers here in Singapore have made. And then second, I want to talk about three broad features that seem to differentiate Singapore from much of the rest of the world. So let me turn to the fundamentals first. I must say, I thought in the very beginning, at the very top of the DPM's presentation, it was very refreshing to hear him say right up front that vaccinations are not a silver bullet, that we can't just vaccinate everybody and that's it. We move on our merry way and the world continues. It is not going to work that way. And that is actually not recognized everywhere around the world. And to say that up front, I think is very, very important. It really sets the stage for expectations of everybody here in Singapore of what is to come. The second, and kind of related to that, was simply the kind of humble statement that Singapore is a small, open economy, and there's a lot of uncertainty out there in the global economy, and all those uncertainties are going to bounce right back on Singapore. And so we don't know what the world is going to look like in a year from now. We don't know what Singapore is going to look like a year from now. We can only do our best and pivot and change course as the global economy changes course as well. So again, I thought these were kind of humble comments that I thought very clearly set the stage for how to think about the budget for this year and beyond. Third, in terms of the fundamentals, the assumption that the economy may grow somewhere between 4% and 6% this year was pretty much spot on. I think it'll be something around 5%, right in the middle of that range that the government is using. And this is critical, of course. There are many policymakers out there in the world that will overestimate what growth will be for the next year or 2 years, and then underestimate what the needs may be. So to be realistic in terms of the economic outlook is critical, and that seems to have been the case here, that policymakers are being very realistic in terms of what the economy may look like. And then finally, just in a sense, the admission of the recognition that some stimulus is still needed. There are many fiscal policy makers out there in the world who would like to put this idea of fiscal stimulus behind them. You know, they did it in 2020. Enough we can't afford it. Let's balance our budgets this year and be on our way. But if every country were to try to balance their budget this year, as nice as that would be, it would likely mean that a good part of the world might fall back into recession, no matter what happens in terms of the pace of COVID and vaccinations and such. And then the fact that the deficit, while there still will be a budget deficit this year, I mean, it's not that great. As Selena mentioned, it's going to go from something around 14% last year to something closer to 2% this year. And there is an ability to fund that. And this is, in a sense, this is a prudent path, kind of a path of providing some insurance that the economy will get it back on its feet, and come 2022 will be in much better shape for it. So, in terms of the fundamentals, I think the budget plan is right on, and made a lot of hard decisions were made, and realistic assumptions were made to come up with the context of what this budget looks like. So those are the fundamentals I wanted to mention, and then the other thing I wanted to do is look at just three broad features and again, kind of differentiate how those features are versus what I see elsewhere in the world. And the three features are the fact that the budget is targeted, that the budget represents the global situation in which Singapore resides, and it also represents the inevitable structural shifts that will happen in the economy. So to go back to the first one, it is targeted, and I think this is an important shift from 2020, and is a difficult shift to make sometimes, because one has to make decisions that there are certain industries or sectors or parts of the population that you're going to support, and others that may not need it. And it was very clear that industries were divided into three tiers. The top tier is kind of the obvious one of aviation, land transport, arts and entertainment. They're going to continue to be supported for the longest at the highest level. And then there will be other tiers. So there's priorities being made. And at this point in the recovery, I think that's very, very important. I must say I was kind of happy to see that arts and entertainment were included in tier one. You don't see this in many budgets around the world. And arts and entertainment, one, employs a lot of people, and two, contributes to the social welfare of the people. I think we all miss being able to go out to live theater or music. That's kind of an aside, but I think it's great that is included in the tier one industries. Also, the focus on the hardest hit in terms of the hardest hit of households or industries, and still maintain that focus on providing some basic fundamental support for those that are really suffering. So that's the targeted part. The global part. A lot of time was spent on the role that Singapore plays in the global economy, and how that can only expand. There's no going back. There was some pretty important points in terms of Singapore maintaining its role in regional and global supply chains within ASEAN, within Asia Pacific, within the global economy, that this interdependence is here to stay, and we'd better prepare for it further and be ready for it. I thought, actually, there weren't a lot of specifics, but one was the intended investment in Changi Airport to make sure that Changi can remain to be as efficient of an airport as possible, given what it has to deal with now in managing all it has to go with COVID. And in fact, we don't even know what that's going to include. There is no global standard yet of how airports are going to function. There's no global standard yet in terms of how international travel is going to be managed. This is a huge question mark. And if Changi can be, and Singapore can be, a leader in this, even so much the better, that then that goes to maintain Singapore as one of the global hubs for air transport and supply chains. Supply chains, both physical and virtual supply chains. I thought the fact that there was a mention of a contribution to COVAX was very good. COVAX is the international agency set up by the World Health Organization to fund emerging markets in their acquisition of, or to donate a virus to emerging markets. And, you know, we're not that far away from very low income countries within ASEAN that need that assistance from COVAX. And if they don't get it, and there are parts of ASEAN, parts of Southeast Asia that are still not effectively vaccinated, then we all suffer, because we all face that risk that it will end up here in Singapore and elsewhere. So that was a very, I think, proper global approach. So targeted effects, the global approach, and then the recognition of structural shifts. I think the idea of retraining labor is probably one of the most important components of this budget, both near term and long term. If you look at policy mistakes in Europe, in North America, elsewhere, as the economy has globalized, perhaps one of the biggest policy mistakes has not been retraining the workforce to be part of the economy of the future. And now is the time, and Singapore already with last year's budget and now this year's budget seems to be there if it can be done in an effective way. So for labor, it's important. For businesses, of course, all the talk of digitization and the green economy. I think even more importantly, there was very explicit talk of ensuring that productivity growth accelerate in Singapore, both to protect against the risks of labor force disruption, like what we see from COVID, and also to be able to operate in with an aging labor force as well, which most of Asia faces going forward. I thought it was interesting. There was this comment about focusing more on LLEs, large local enterprises. I must say that's not really a term I was familiar with before. All of the support, so much of the support around the world has been towards SMEs, because as small and medium-sized enterprises, because they often lack the access to credit that was made available by monetary policy makers. The larger enterprises usually have access to credit and can take advantage of liquidity and lower interest rates. I do think, though, in a way, the pivot a little bit to these LLEs is good, because they do have the scale to grow, the scale to employ, and the scale to compete globally. What I hope is that this doesn't become a shift away from SMEs, but an addition to the support of SMEs, because as mentioned earlier, I mean, SMEs just employ a lot of people and are a very necessary part of the economy. And finally, there was this clear pivot towards long-term objectives, and not just looking this isn't a survival budget. It's a budget. It's a launching budget, if you will. It seems to be anyway, to launch into the future. The long-term bonds for infrastructure is a part of that. Longer-term equity investing and so forth are very critical in terms of pivoting towards the long term. And finally, in terms of uncertainties, I think the uncertainties that I felt were kind of similar to what Selena was mentioning, in terms of it would be awfully nice for businesses and households to know when the GST will actually be hiked. The timing will be important, and I think it's good that they're not doing it this year. We saw last year what happened in Japan when Japan raised the GST, or not last year, but in late 2019, pardon me, and the economy actually contracted for a quarter right after their hike in the GST. So the economy has to be in a good shape and a good path going forward to be able to do that with minimal hurt to the economy. And of course, there was just some talk about corporate taxes, but nothing in detail at all. And this goes back to the comments earlier that Professor Lee mentioned in terms of cost of doing business that needs to be addressed, and with some certainty. And with the future of corporate taxes uncertain, I think that's an important point to make. So I will leave it there, and Manu, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And again, some really very interesting points made comparing Singapore, how we are more targeted, how we are responding to global changes, and also the way the budget tries to accommodate structural changes such as an aging society. And you rightly pointed out the new focus on this thing called LLEs, which I think personally is very timely, because we haven't talked about LLEs, but we talk a lot about PLEs, which are poor local enterprises, which have felt very neglected in the past. So perhaps this is a sign of welcome change in policy. So thank you, Stephen. And let me now move on to invite Dr. Bauta to give his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to start sharing my screen, and maybe, yeah, so there's just one a practical small thing. So Mr. Manu, since once I enter the PPT slideshow mode, I would not be able to see the time on the screen. So in case I go over time, please feel free to interrupt me and remind me. Okay, so let me share my screen. I hope it's working. And then I'm going to make, the slideshow. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to share some of my very humble view about the budget 2021. Okay, so first I'm going to give some very quick comments about the overall feeling about the budget. Actually, in terms of the overall discussion of budget, I think we already had very nice comments by Miss Serena Ling and Dr. Cochrane, so I'm not going to add too much on this. So first of all, I think I will freeze this year's deficit as a very, very mild one. So this is according to the comparison to the international standards. So for example, if we compare to the Western countries, just also as Dr. Cochrane already mentioned, so if we look at the numbers in the United States, actually the debt is like 14.9% of the GDP last year. And even in this year, they are still expecting something like a 10.3% GDP deficit, which is much higher than ours. So ours is really a very, very mild one. But of course, it's also based on some kind of a better control of the pandemic and a better economic outlook, because we all know that we're expecting 4 to 6% economic growth this year, which explains a lot of things. And at the same time, of course, I also understand maybe some people are going to ask, right? So then why don't the government just jump directly to zero deficit? And in this case, maybe since I'm a behavioral economist, I'm going to talk about something more like psychological or maybe sentimental, so to some extent. So I think as we all know that in economics, or especially behavioral economics, there is one word that's getting very popular in the recent years. So it's called narrative economics, So basically it says that when you talk about economic information, it's not only the content of the information that matters, but also your narrative of it and how people feel about the narrative that actually in some situations may matter even more than the content of the information. So this is proposed by Nobel Prize winner Robert Shiller. So Robert Shiller is also currently a professor in the Yale University School of Management. So here I just paste a figure from Twitter. It's, as you can see, it's actually from the ECB, the European Central Bank. This is a post, this is a tweet by ECB on the Valentine's Day. So it reads, roses are red, violets are blue. We'll keep financing conditionals favorable till the crisis is through. So, I mean, this doesn't sound really, very central bank, right? So because usually we think that when we talk about central banks are kind of digit animals or number animals. They only talk in terms of numbers. But why do they suddenly jump to something like very poetic, very artistic, and actually indeed very romantic saying to the public? And actually that's part of their new kind of what we call central bank communication strategy. So I think that that's indeed something like also the government's initiative to convey some information, like in terms of the narratives. So I think in this year, I highly appreciate the government's initiative that we have different tiers of industries, and especially to show the devotion or determination to work together with the kind of a badly affected industries and firms to go out of the pandemic, to go out of the impact to the last. So there's a feeling of a companion. And actually, maybe I can also quickly mention two other things that I feel quite nice in the budget address. First one is at the beginning of the speech, Deputy Prime Minister mentioned that the whole government expressed sincere thanks to our medical workers. And also after that, he also mentioned that, well, and then we're going to have a salary increase for the medical workers. But I think the few sentences he said about this thing was marvelous and very touching, actually. which is, I think, also very important for government in this situation. It's very important to increase the morale of people and give the people the confidence and the feeling of a good feeling. Okay, so that's my quick comments about overall. And secondly, yeah, I think in terms of specific items, I pay a lot of attention to the green plan. This is already mentioned by Prof. David Lee. So we announced this Singapore Green Plan, I think in February 10, a few days before the budget of 2021 was announced. And in general, the related items, as I noticed, maybe not totally exhaustive, will be cleaner energy vehicles, develop Singapore as a leading center of green finance. This one, I think, is already well covered by Prof. Lee. And then also there is an expected increase in the carbon tax. So, I mean, recently I pay a lot of attention to cleaner energy vehicles, especially the EV, the electric vehicles. I noticed that the government set aside 30 million money for the R&D activity in this industry. I think that's very important. That's very timely. So basically, and also the government have some policy like require all new registrations to be cleaner energy models by 2030. And also build more EV infrastructure. So for example, by doubling the charging points from the scheduled 28,000 to 60,000. And also to revise the tax structure to also make it easier, give more incentive to buy EV. I think this is very important. So we all know that there are many advantages of EV. So for example, that's cleaner energy, and actually the reaction time, the rack of the machine is also actually better than the traditional cars, and also it reduces the reliance on the traditional energy sources. And also, I do think that, I mean, I fully understand some people are complaining currently the technology for EV is not perfect. So there are many, many flaws in it and can bring a lot of trouble. And people make all kinds of even like bad jokes or nicknames for the EVs. But still, I mean, this is my very personal view. I'm pretty kind of aggressive in this kind of making speculations. I do think that EV is definitely the future. And I do see it like just a competition between modern gun using fire powder and the traditional bow and arrows. So we all know that at the very beginning, in terms of accuracy and many, many properties, efficiencies, the guns are worse than bows and arrows. But the main thing is that that's how technology evolves over time, because after the Industrial Revolution, right, it's just much easier to produce guns and much easier to train the soldiers to use guns. So in the long run, so it just doesn't matter the starting point or the starting level of efficiency and performance. So it's just the direction or the direction of the tide of time. So I really do think that EV is really the future of transportation. And as we can see that the market is growing very rapidly in recent years. I think last year that scores like scores like 2.1 million sales in the market, and according to the forecast by IEA, they say that probably the total sales will reach 1 to 5 million by year 2030. And I personally don't think that's a too aggressive expectation, because we all know that technology has network externality. So when more people are using it, when the government builds more infrastructure in it, actually this thing can jump even faster than we are thinking of it as thinking now. And also at this period, at this point of time, right? So I got these two figures. So I think these two figures, I'm not saying it's the reason the government make the investment, but I think it's part of the explanation. So, so for example, so first, if you look at the right panel, the right figure, you will see that in terms of the new purchase of cars, like the market share of an EV in the whole market, we see that already there are some countries, especially the European ones, they are having 20% of the total sales going to the EVs. So basically, you see that it's happening very rapidly. in many countries, especially the developed world. And also at the same time, if you look at the charging point, so this is the right figure, the right panel. So if you look at the right figure, so we are seeing something like, okay, so in terms of the number of plug-in infrastructure, European countries are again leading the world. And if you look at both figures, so for the moment, right, we see that Singapore is not in a leading position in the world. But if we already know at this point, right, this is the future trend of the world. So then it's right. So basically, of course, we don't want this to be also the situation in the future. We want the situation in Singapore to take off, and we want Singapore to kind of run into the top of the list, run into the top of the ranking, because that's the future. Okay, so I think that's probably part of the reason why the government decided to just kind of substantially enlarge the number of charging points in their schedule. And therefore, I mean, my short comment for this schedule will be that it's very highly timely, highly needed. And also at the same time, I would say that because this is the industry for the future, so then a healthy local market for EV is also very important, very encouraging for creating jobs for our future generations in the related industry. And here is basically my suggestion. So we all know that, I mean, of course, everybody wants to get a good share of the market. But of course, then if we have the international competition, then it matters like which country has what kind of comparative advantage. So we know that Tesla already throw their gigafactory in Shanghai. So then probably in the short run, it's not going to be highly likely that we get another gigafactory in Singapore, right? Or also at the same time, in terms of the number of workers and these kind of things, it's probably also not easy for Singapore as a small country to compete with China as a very big country. But still, I mean, I think maybe probably the government is already working on it. We're going to see that soon in the future, but right. So basically, it's just like the country's strategy for AI or biotech. So Singapore can always try to find some small and beautiful part of the industry, especially the small and beautiful part of the technology, to try to specialize in and try to get a unique kind of position in the world value chain. And also suppose, right, we are doing successful on that, we're leading the world. So in the long run, we can also profit from it by selling, for example, this advanced technology in battery cells or self-driving system, let's say to US, to Japan, to China, or to Germany. That's surely something, I would say that 30 million is a very nice start, but also at the same time, I'm expecting more for the future. I think that's, and also the self-driving system is also a nice combination with our existing strategy of building the advantage in AI. So I think this also partly goes back to Prof. Lee's question. So I think that may be a good complementary. So I think that's basically about it. And then green finance, yeah. So for green finance, I think green bond is already covered by Prof. Lee. And here it's just like, if you look at the IPO of EV manufacturers, that's also a huge market. We see the Chinese guys, they all get something between like 15 billion to 37 billion. They now go to NASDAQ. But I think in the future, there surely will be some opportunities. I mean, Singapore has some special advantage compared to US, compared to Hong Kong, especially in the current international setting. So definitely that's something that Singapore Stock Exchange can try to explore. And also in terms of carbon tax, I'm going to be very brief. I see that carbon tax is going to probably increase from 5 Singapore dollar per ton to 10 to 15 Singapore dollar per ton by 2030. So basically, I'm just trying to look at a number and also make some comparison. I see that the current number in the US is something like $5 per ton. So which means that our number is quite internationally comparable. And also remember, this is the number during the Trump administration. And during the Biden administration, I would expect that, I think most of us will expect that this number at least will double or maybe triple or even more. So I really think that this is a very reasonable adjustment. And also at the same time, since we know that actually Singapore has the first digital trading platform for carbon emission rights in Asia. So, I mean, if we do this thing sufficiently well, we do that sufficiently well for the domestic market, and actually that's also some good service, good fintech service that we can export to our neighbors. I think basically that's probably all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bauta. Again, you've, I think, helped us by providing some very interesting insights into the technology side of it. And in particular, I think you've raised the question whether we need to do a lot more. 30 million, as you said, is a nice start, but perhaps we should build on that. So thank you very much, and thank you all the panelists, because you've been remarkably good at sticking to the time. So we now have about 25 minutes for Q&A. There are a couple of questions that have come out already, but I would encourage our participants to perhaps key in to either the chat box or the Q&A box further questions, so that we can have a very good discussion. The first question came from, I think, Sharon Ng, and basically is regarding the rising costs of business. And if I could paraphrase, her concern is that highly skilled professionals are facing rising challenges with the employment situation, influx of foreign talents, and the cost of running business being very high. There's a risk that you get more offshoring of work, and that would disadvantage, in particular, our PMETs. And so her question is, how do we strike a balance in the workforce? Is enough being done? I guess the question is that some of the budget measures will actually increase the cost of doing business. Does the panel think that this is a big challenge? Who would like to answer Sharon's question? Any of the panelists would like to try? Maybe Selena? Sorry.
Ladies first, is it?
You have the privilege.
Okay. I'm not sure there is a simple answer to this. I mean, the reality is that we have an aging population, increasingly educated population as well. So in the past, the challenge was, how to uplift the low income and lowly skilled workers. I think now it's going the other way. PMET over time probably will become one of the policy focus groups. And I think if you look at the jobs growth initiative, they have actually prioritized the older workers. So workers who are age 40 and above, I think all of us here fall into that category. So I think the issue really is, it takes two hands to clap, right? I mean, the government policies can go only that far to attract the firms and the investments to come in, but you need the workforce to be agile, to be nimble, to upskill and reskill. And I think the sad truth is no amount of money that you throw at it, whether it's into Skills Future or anything else, can get people to get out of their comfort zone and to go and train for a totally new area or totally new industry if they're not completely convinced or if they're not pushed out of their comfort zone. So maybe the crisis, in a sense, has accelerated some of that change, because through the displacement, and you realize that certain industries which you thought were fairly safe, like aviation, for instance. I mean, we were so proud of Changi Airport and ourselves as an aviation hub. And nobody can foresee that a pandemic can wipe out your visitor arrivals to 2% of what they used to be, right? And you don't even know how long it's going to take to come back. So I think these are some of the existential threats that we're currently facing. And we all have to ask ourselves what needs to be done. But essentially, at the end of the day, we need to keep up the competition. And now with remote working, the competition is really global. So I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say something since I raised the issue. I think I agree with Selena in the sense that it's important to look at the cost issue, but also important to realize that every marginal talent that comes in, it creates a lot more value added and jobs. I think that's what everybody wants. The question is that during a COVID period, where there's no mobility, when you try to move to a lower, because jobs are global now, they are virtual. You can be a programmer, you can be a sales, you can be anywhere, you can live in Indonesia, you can live in elsewhere, but with the COVID, I think people feel that they're trapped. I think this is just a transition period, as I mentioned, in a sense, but in the long term, we can see quite clearly that I think DPM already said about the S-Pass and so on. And also there's identification of scale transfer, where every time where every country faces the same thing. And as an open economy, we have to be as inclusive as possible. I think there is a demand from certain part of the population that requires that every time somebody comes in, then there must be some transfer of scale or the value added. And it's the kind of measurement that I think people are looking into, which I think is being addressed in the budget about giving out S-Pass, having mentoring system. But in the long term, I just like DPM said, you can work from anywhere. The challenge doesn't come from anyone that is in the country. And same as what is Sharon saying, everywhere is the same. Then it becomes the issue of cost of doing business, because that you have 30% renter, 30%, so-called your goods, cost of goods, and 30% of salary. Then really you got to compare that with the rest of the world. The only disadvantage we have that we don't have, rural area and urban area, so that you can actually move outside the city and live a more casual life. So in Singapore, you feel that you're trapped. You can only move as far as Jurong. So you can't, or maybe as far as, one of the islands that we have. But if only we have Christmas Island, then we have been different, right? So that's where I think people feel trapped, and therefore it becomes an issue. And then we just need to balance it. But to be very frank, competition comes from all over, and they are virtual. So we are an open economy. We must always be open, whether in the physical sense or in the virtual sense. And more so, we have to be in the virtual sense. That is totally open, that talent from anywhere should be welcome, and especially they can contribute. The key question is that, what is that measurement that we are talking about? How much contribution, the marginal contribution from anyone that come and occupy a space? So I think that is probably the way to answer it, and also to compare the cost of doing business with the rest of the businesses elsewhere, knowing that we only have the cities, the rental in the city as well. So is there any other way, which I suppose we are doing, to have cheaper renters in shared spaces in Block 71, 79, or in some JTC? We really have done all those, So can we do better? I think that's the question.
Thank you, David. Anyone else wants to try that question? If not, we'll move on then. There's a comment in the chat box from Philip Chua. He says there's hardly any budget relief for the social sector, which is badly hit with fundraising, other than the 250% tax deduction. Why is this the case? And I guess what more should we do about this? And anyone wants to try that? Who wants to?
So maybe I can give it a try,
please,
but
thank you.
I'm not sure I'm able to really give a proper answer to it. So first of all, I do think that social sector is very, very important. So I also noticed that this part of address in the budget. So and also indeed, so some of the times we say that maybe the social sector or the charity, some of the activities is counted in GDP, and some of the activities, they are not counted in GDP. But especially as a kind of a developed economy, and also as a country or government that care about people's well-being, both material and also the subjective one. So charity is very, very important. It's not only for this simple economic activity, but also for kind of this, so feeding of a home and so on. I guess I can only make a guess because I'm not really an expert on charity. My guess is like the following. So, on the one hand, I think indeed, so a social sector or charity may suffer a lot because when the economic climate is not doing well, then so in general, they tend to receive less donation from individuals and also from firms. And in this case, I do think that first of all, the tax reduction will probably help. And actually, we have that kind of a large initiative in NTU, and I think many of our colleagues did try to make some contribution. And at the same time, I think maybe when Mr. Chua was asking this question, he was asking, why doesn't the government like give money directly to the charities so that they can go over this special period? And I think in this case, maybe one of the possibilities that the government is trying to avoid something that we call soft budget issue in economics. So soft budget issue basically means that when an entity, a firm or an organization is not running well, and if there is somebody to back up the situation, so then there is always kind of a moral hazard, and maybe this will also reduce the incentive for the organization to raise profit or raise fund for itself in the future. I don't think I have an answer to this question. I think probably maybe there's surely maybe some ways maybe the government can consider in the future. So for example, I mean, on the one hand, I don't think it's a good idea for the government. I also don't think it's a good idea for the government to pay kind of directly to the charity, especially do that on a regular basis. And then if you're doing that, you're kind of literally you're just nationalizing the charity, or you're making it a part of the government body, which might not be something you're really after. But at the same time, I'm not sure. I mean, and then it's quite complicated. So in some situations, could maybe the government consider like lending some money to the charity, or maybe like signing some contracts with the charity, like providing more matching during the special period of time for the charity, such that you don't make them more generate more reliance on the government, but at the same time you're still trying to make their situation easier. I mean, again, it's not. I'm not an expert. It's not a proper answer to the question, but just something I have in my mind.
Thank you. I think that puts things in perspective. Anyone else wants to add? Maybe Stephen?
If I might add, yeah, you know, I think one way of particularly this idea of supporting the charitable side of the economy, I think if the government, in a sense, treats charities the way it does any small or medium-sized enterprise, it'll be to their benefit. I think charities got through COVID much the way small enterprises did. Either they couldn't survive and they folded because donations just disappeared, or they were able to manage at least some donations, but even more importantly, they changed their business process. They managed their inventory better. They delivered, the whole idea of how you deliver social services has changed in COVID with social distancing. You cannot deal with groups. You all of a sudden have to deal with individuals. You can't have groups coming to you. You've got to go to individuals. In a sense, the whole business structure, if you will, of providing charitable services has changed. And if there is going to be a training and investment in workforce and business processes and so forth, well, get the charities in there as well, because they like everybody else have been forced to change the way they do business to survive. And in fact, they may have some lessons that for-profit enterprises might be able to take advantage of.
Thank you. Any other comments? If not, there's another question that's just coming in from Jorinda Su. Is the attention on EV too hyped up, given that it is only 30 million over a period of 5 years, which is approximately 0.03% of the estimated budget expenditure of 102 billion? Who would like? I mean, I guess the broader question here, which I also had in mind to ask, is despite the very appropriate highlighting of this whole issue of sustainability, are the amounts devoted to it really likely to move the needle at all? It seems very tentative and small to me, frankly. Anybody wants to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll try, Manu.
Thanks, David.
I think Selena earlier on said about the bonds and so on. So I also commented that this is a strategy. I think DPN did say that all these bonds should be issued when the interest rate is low. That's what he has mentioned. And I think from my own opinion, humble opinion, is that we found a strategy to continue to renew the entire nation, involving everyone from every sector, you know, and perhaps funded by this 90 billion over a number of years to about 2030, and have certain targets for the climate change to solve some of our traditional problem with the nascent technology. So it is a convergence of the sustainability with nation construction and building. In that sense, to enhance the property values and the living condition of this country, taking advantage of the lower interest rate environment. So the EV is just one aspect of it for the mindset change. Because I think the most important thing about technology and national strategy is about mindset change. And I think this strategy of going to 2030 with lower carbon, less contamination, and so on. And it happens that even in China, you can start using this bond as reserve. So you can sort of anticipate from the financial world that the sovereign wealth fund, the fund managers will start to look at the valuation, and then they start to own some of these bonds. And you can see that sovereign bonds in the traditional sense is in great danger, especially your country is in debt. So I think there is a switch in the investment landscape that the national strategy must, look into the future asset allocation strategy of fund managers and sovereign wealth fund, and then chart accordingly how you can rebuild the entire nation involving everyone, and also in line with the Social Development Goal 2030 with the UN, and also with the China taking the lead of with RCEP, DCEP, and the rest to tie in with the lot of digital infrastructure that we are building. So it's a whole set of government machinery that's working to build a digital infrastructure for the entire ASEAN with the RCEP, BRI 2.0 and so on. So I don't see it as just 30 million. I see it as an entire national strategy tying in from a smart nation to, from a smart nation, smart city to a sustainable city. So that is a very, very different strategy to tie in with our capabilities and our competitive advantage.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to add to that?
Maybe I can quickly just add one point. So I think basically here, so on the one hand, maybe there is needs for some government investment for the R&D process, but in the long run, probably the most important thing is still the government enterprise cooperation, like for-profit commercialization of the business model. And in this case, I can easily think of, I think, probably the most efficient way, if possible, would be something like just similar to the Singapore Rolls-Royce joint venture, right? So in this case, if Singapore can have some cooperation with, I don't know, Tesla or maybe some EV companies in China, and those will probably work much better than kind of just government pumping in money and trying to create some well, I mean, they are complementary. I'm not saying that you should remove that part, but again, if you're talking about a big business, still that the most important thing is a government big enterprise corporation.
Yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. There's one more question that's just come in. Maybe we'll switch to that. It's from Zach Lee. Is the extension of the SG United Jobs and Skills package a strong signal that the labor market is not going to recover as fast as the economy in general? In other words, GDP bounces back, but maybe labor market does not strengthen as much. Zach continues to say, considering the opportunity for structural change in the labor market as well. Anybody wants to take that?
Okay, I can take a stab at this.
Please,
I think the official rhetoric coming out has been quite clear that they expect that the labor market will stay soft. So although we saw that the unemployment rates actually did stabilize in the last 2 months of last year, but it's also quite apparent in the business expectation survey that for both manufacturers and for the services firms, although we are seeing a slightly faster recovery in terms of the general sentiments and the outlook for the first half of this year, but hiring intentions actually remain very, very tepid. So if I recall correctly, 0% and only 4% of the services and manufacturing firms actually do intend to hire fresh staff in the first quarter of this year. So I think, although all these vaccine-filled hopes of recovery has been making its rounds in the market, but it only extends as far as probably the strength of the new orders that are coming in. It hasn't translated to, intentions to hire. And that's probably the reason why the government feels compelled to spend another 2.9 billion for the job support scheme, right? I mean, these are huge numbers you're talking about. They're talking about using this to, create another 200,000 jobs for local workers this year, and another 35,000 traineeships. Of course, it's hard, again, to quantify how many jobs would have been lost if this support was not there. But if you just do a very superficial math, that's a huge amount of money to spend on each job, actually. So I think that there is a lot of concern that if, they don't do anything and more workers get displaced, and you really have this scenario where it's probably, the guys at the two ends that are going to maybe suffer more, then you could actually end up with the inequality and social problems down the road. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons why they feel compelled to continue to spend a lot of money in this area.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to chip in? Thanks, Lena.
Yeah, maybe I can just add that, the jobs that have been lost are, primarily service sector jobs, and many of them low skill, low productivity, low value added kinds of jobs. They're not the jobs that are going to actually come back very naturally in an economy where costs are still going to be very, very important, and uncertainty is going to be very, very high for a while. And Selena mentioned just the potential for rising inequality across the labor force. I mean, this is going to be really critical in terms of managing social cohesion and then generating a broader contribution to economic growth. So I think broadly here in Singapore, and really in most places around the world, there will be a part of the labor force that's going to be very, very slow to turn around, primarily in the service sector. And the kind of support to retrain, to upskill, and so forth, and either prepare them simply to be for the labor force to be more efficient in the service sector, or actually elevating people into higher value-added jobs, and if just to use the word digitization as a broad category, I think will be really, really critical going forward. This, I think, should be a high priority across any kind of fiscal stimulus program.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, maybe just a quick one.
Yes, please, David.
For me, that has to do with collaboration efficiency among the companies in Singapore. I feel that there is a major factor. There are only so many things that the government can do, and it's already at full speed with a huge budget deficit last year. So, going forward, if the companies are not going to transform, and I feel that, we always have a dilemma. Do we disrupt them a lot faster so that we lose a lot more jobs in the short term, or do we maintain their market structure in a monopolistic way, because the country is small, you still need a certain scale. So there is a constant trade-off that we have to think about. But I feel that my opinion is that the collaboration among the big firms and the small is not as good as you see in some countries. I think there's a lot more to be improved on that. And I'm not too sure whether there's something that the government can do, but I would certainly like to see more collaboration such that, you know, the bigger ones are there to let the entire country feel that they are helping the smaller one, rather than, you know, everybody is in difficult situation. Everybody are facing their shareholders. Everybody is facing the board of directors, giving them a lot of pressure. But at some stage, I think we need to have, you know, we need to go a very different direction and say that we are here for the long term. I'm a Singapore company. So I have to take out a portion of profit and I want to help to build a lot more. But if you have a corporate VC, but you're still having the mindset of, you know, monopolistic structure, then I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I would like to see more level playing field, a lot more contractship, a lot more collaboration efficiency going forward. I think that will lessen the pressure on the government in trying to solve this 200,000 plus 35,000 when we go back to post-COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm afraid we are running out of time, so I need to bring this to a conclusion. It's impossible to summarize such a rich exchange of views, but I think there are a couple of takeaways for me. One is that budgets are horrendously difficult to execute even in normal times. These are not normal times. They're difficult because you have to get a balance right in so many different trade-offs. And I guess, as many of the panelists have commented, in a way, this budget is work in progress. You know, it'll evolve with time, whether it is the amount of money we, you know, allocate to EVs or in other areas. So the main thing is that we are heading in the right direction. We've got the balances more or less right. And as Stephen has pointed out, in comparison with budgets and fiscal approaches elsewhere, I think we are probably in a fairly comfortable position. So it leaves me now to thank each of our panelists, David, Selina, Stephen, and Wouter. Thank you very much for all your contributions. And thank you to the audience for participating and providing us with so many interesting questions and comments. Thank you very much, and I hand you back to Yao Hui.
Right. Thank you very much, Manu. We have come to the end of this session. Thank you for your support. We look forward to your participation in our next ESS event. Do watch out on our website for more events from the Economic Society of Singapore. See you then.